Close your eyes and open your mind. I'm your host Michael, and welcome to This Strange Void. Hey strangers, welcome to another episode of This Strange Void. We've already made it to episode 5. Wow. I'm so glad that I ended up starting this podcast, as I've been a bit hesitant for a while as to whether or not to start it, as I have a full-time job and a young baby in the house. So my life is already a bit hectic at the moment, so why not slap on another project? But all jokes aside, it's been a great way to spend my free time instead of just playing video games or watching the same TV shows I've seen 100 times. You know how it is. Plus, I'm also learning more about the subjects that I've always had an interest in, but I just haven't taken a deep dive into the history and the lore about the legends that we've told for generations. I am so sorry about the delay in this episode. After 3 years of dodging it, my family and I finally got the dreaded COVID-19, and I had previously recorded this episode, but due to being congested and nasally, I couldn't stand listening to myself, let alone putting it out there for the world to hear. But yeah, so once again, I want to thank you for tuning into the pod. I hope you learn a little something about today's topic though. Today I'll be diving into some interesting cases of time slips. Are these purely cases of fiction? People in strange places being mistaken by unfamiliar surroundings? Or are these people stumbling upon something that we have no reference for? Something powerful and beyond our understanding? After all, time is purely a concept created by us humans. What if the world doesn't play by our rules and can jump back and forth as it sees fit? So before I ramble on for too long, let's get started with some of the stories. Probably one of the most famous time slip stories involves Senior Royal Air Force Commander Sir Robert Victor Goddard. He claimed to have experienced a time slip in 1935. He flew over what had been RAF Station Drem in Scotland from his way from Edinburgh to Andover, England. The Drem station was no longer in use after demobilisation efforts following World War I. It had mostly been left to its own devices, and, indeed, that's what Goddard said he saw as he flew over it. A largely abandoned airfield. But on his return trip though, things got weird. He followed the same route he had on the way there, but during the flight, he got waylaid by a storm. As he struggled to regain control of his plane, however, he spotted the Drem airfield through the break in the clouds. And when he got closer to it, the bad weather suddenly dissipated. But the airfield wasn't abandoned this time. It was busy, with several planes on the runway and mechanics scurrying about. Within seconds though, the storm reappeared and Goddard had to fight to keep his plane aloft again. He made it home just fine though, and went on to live another 50 years, but the incident stuck with him. Indeed, in 1975 he wrote a book called Flight Towards Reality, which included a discussion of the whole thing. Here's the really weird bit though. In 1939 the Drem airfield was brought back to life. Did Goddard see a peek into the airfield's future via a time slip back in 1935? Who knows? If you're enjoying the podcast, you, stranger, can help me out. I have a Patreon up and running which directly helps me out. You will gain access to the private Discord channel where I'll be posting strange and wonderful things and also be chatting about possible topics for future episodes. There is also some cool Strange Void merch for higher tiers, so that's also a bonus. You can help me out for less than a cup of coffee. You can find me over at patreon.com/thisstrangevoid. If you can't help out though, there is always a way that you can help out for free by leaving a rating and review anywhere you may be listening. It does go a long way to help, and you can also follow the podcast on Spotify, which will notify you when a new episode has gone live right as it happens. I'm also on Instagram where I post memes that I find funny and other spooky stuff that I find. You can find me at thisstrangevoid. Even just word of mouth. If you like the podcast, just tell a friend. It helps so much, and I cannot possibly thank you guys enough. Liverpool has its fair share of urban legends, spooky tales, and local myths, but perhaps none more puzzling than the time slips of Bold Street. Over the years, a number of people claim to have slipped into another time period while walking along the city centre street. Bizarrely, those who claim to have time travelled along Bold Street were able to recount specific details from the past that they encountered during the experience. There are areas all over Liverpool and Merseyside that seem to have time slip hotspots, but the highest saturation of time anomalies is the thoroughfare of Bold Street in the heart of the city. One of the first time slips I'd heard of concerned an off-duty policeman from Melling named Frank. One Saturday in 1996, Frank and his wife visited Liverpool to do some shopping. At Central Station, the couple split up. His wife went to Dylan's bookshop on Bold Street to purchase a copy of Irvine Welsh's book Trainspotting, and Frank went to a record store. About 20 minutes later, he walked up an incline which was leading to Bold Street, intended to meet up with his wife in the bookshop, when he noted that he somehow entered a dead spot of quietness. Suddenly, a small box van that looked like something out of the 1950s sped across his path, beeping its horn as it narrowly missed him. Frank noted that the van had the name Kaplan's emblazoned on its side. Frank crossed the road and saw Dylan's bookshop was no longer there. In its place stood a store named Cripps over its two entrances. The policeman was understandably confused. He looked in the window of Cripps and saw no books on display, but women's handbags and shoes. The policeman turned around and saw that the people on Bold Street were wearing what would have been in vogue in the 40s and 50s. The men wore trilbies and long overcoats, and women wore scarves, berets, and pillbox and cartwheel hats, and most of the ladies also wore gloves. Then the possibility that he had somehow walked into Bold Street 40-odd years ago dawned on the policeman, until Frank sighted a girl of about 20 dressed in the clothes of the mid-1990s, hipsters in a lime-coloured sleeveless top. The bag she carried had the name Miss Selfridge's on it, which really assured the policeman that he was somehow partially in 1996. He smiled at the girl as she walked past him and entered Cripps. As Frank followed her, the whole interior of the building changed in a flash to the interior of Dylan's bookshop. The policeman was back in his own time. He grabbed the girl by the arm at the entrance of the bookshop and asked her, "Did you see that?" The girl calmly said, "Yeah, I thought this was a new shop that had just opened. I was going in to look at some clothes and now it's just a bookshop." The girl just chuckled, shook her head and walked out again. When Frank told his wife about the incident, she said that she had not noticed anything strange, but Frank was really adamant that he had not hallucinated the episode. In the late 50s and early 60s, there had been a store called Cripps in the exact location where Dylan's was. And there also had been a firm called Kaplan's in existence around the same time. In 1979, two couples were driving through France on holiday, Jeff and Pauline Simpson and Len and Cynthia Gibbsy. Looking for a place to stay, they found a motel, but they were told there was no vacancies, and that they should try it further down the road, so they set off and soon found themselves driving down a cobbled street. They paused to take an interest in an oddly old-fashioned sign for a circus. Soon they came across a long, low, stone building. An inn. What luck. The couples went inside and they were shown to their rooms. The windows had no glass in them, they were just simple wooden shutters, and the furniture was basic. There was no pillows, no telephones, and nothing remotely modern. After eating a meal, steak, eggs, and beer, they retired to bed. At breakfast in the dining room the next morning, they were struck by some bizarrely dressed individuals. A woman in a silk evening gown came in carrying a dog. It was strange, Pauline said. It looked like she had just come in from a ball, but it was 7 in the morning. I couldn't take my eyes off of her. There was also some policemen wearing uniforms that were later dated from 1905. Later paying their bill, the couples were astonished when they were asked for just 19 francs. just over £2 to cover their stay. 2 weeks down the line, on their way home from holiday, they decided to stay at the hotel again, but it was no longer there. And developing the rolls of film they'd snapped with their camera, all the negatives of the photos they'd taken at the hotel were missing. Baffled, they returned 4 years later again to try and locate the hotel. They never found it. Now, the last story kind of reminded me of a tale I remember hearing about a couple of newlyweds a few years ago, but I cannot seem to find any information to corroborate the story that they apparently told. But yeah, I'll try and tell it as best as I can from memory. Around the mid to late 1980s, a young couple were driving through regional France en route to their honeymoon destination, tucked away in a small French village. After leaving later than they had planned, they arrived at the village well after dark. They were surprised to see just how dark the village was though. The roads were cobblestone and the small houses were scattered throughout. Unsure as to where to park, they parked in an open area close to the main road that they had just drove down entering the village. Finding what seemed to be the hotel that they had booked for the night, they entered and found the place dimly lit by candlelight and oil lamps. Walking up to the front desk and speaking broken French, the husband stated their names and that they had booked the honeymoon suite. The man behind the counter just simply grunted at them and handed them the ledger book. Once they signed and were handed the key, a lady was called to show them to their room. They walked up the winding staircase to the second floor. As they reached the door, the lady handed the husband her lamp so that she could use both hands to open the solid wooden door. The door creaked as it scraped along the floor. In the room lay 2 beds, the room covered in dust, with a spiderweb stretched between the 2 beds. In disgust, the husband stated, "This is unacceptable. We are on our honeymoon, and the room isn't even clean." The lady nodded her head and took them back downstairs. As they reached the front desk, the man was nowhere to be seen, so they left the key on the desk. Walking back to the car, the husband felt like an absolute jerk, as he was the one who had planned the accommodation for the duration of their trip. Not having any other option, they slept in their car till the morning. Once the sun had risen, the small village looked oddly unfamiliar from the one that they had explored the previous night. Walking up to the first hotel that they could find, they entered and spoke to the man behind the counter. The husband joked about how terrible the housekeeping was at the hotel that they had booked. Puzzled, the man behind the counter stated that they were in the hotel that they were speaking of, and they must have been mistaken. A quick search in their booking showed that the honeymoon suite had yet to be checked in, and as long as they didn't mind paying the late check-in fee, the room was still theirs. In 1971, a pickup truck trundled up the cattle pasture near Ponca City, Oklahoma, stopping at the gate. Its occupants Carl, Mark, and Gordon had been sent up there to pick up a feeder. Carl said, "We opened the gate, which was barbed wire with no lock, and entered. We went on the property, which was covered in grass, up to and over the hood of the truck. They drove their pickup through the grass to the feeder and got out. We realized the tank was almost half full and far too heavy to load," Carl said. "We decided to leave and drove around the red barn when we saw a large 2-story white house with no lights on in front of us. So they went back to their employer and explained, and their boss said he'd drain the tank so they could pick it up the next day. We went to the location to retrieve the tank the next night," Carl said. "This time we decided to go through the old white big house on the hill and brought our shotguns. What they saw was incomprehensible though. The house, was no longer there," Carl said. "We walked up the hill to where it stood and there was no signs of demolition, no foundations, nothing at all. What we all seemed to witness the night before was no longer there. We have talked to each other over the years, but none of us can begin to explain this vision." So that draws another episode to a close. It's just so hard to wrap my head around the whole thing. What would happen if, say, the couple stayed in the motel instead of going and sleeping in their car, would they be trapped 100, 200 years ago? Or would they wake up in a field or someone's house? Like, what would happen? Like, does that explain missing people that just there's no sign of them? It'd be so scary, confusing, like, wow. So yeah, thank you for listening. I'm not gonna go on because yeah, I'm just gonna go on a tangent and not really start making sense, and I'll probably probably lose listeners. So yeah, I just want to thank you again for tuning in. I'm so sorry about the delay in release of this episode right after I said that I was going to be doing it every 2 weeks, but yeah, I got sick and it sounded horrible, and I only want to keep getting better with the production quality instead of going back like 3 steps. It sounded worse than when I first started. So yeah, thank you, strangers. I guess I'll see you guys on the other side. Bye.